When the HOA tried to control my land with a fine, I didn't argue. I made a move they never saw coming. I bought the land they loved the most and locked it forever. It began with a plain white envelope, the kind that usually brings nothing but junk mail or property tax notices. But this one had the emblem of the HOA printed neatly in the top left corner, the kind of envelope that feels heavier than its weight. Inside, a letter, formal in tone, cold in language, stating that I was being fined for hunting on my own property. Not warned, not asked for clarification, just fined. At first, I genuinely thought it was a mistake. I own a stretch of land that borders the neighborhood. It's zoned for mixed use. I've lived on it for years and the boundaries are clearly marked. What I do on that land has always been my business. I hunt responsibly within legal hunting seasons with all permits in place. It's a tradition, a way of life that I've followed since my father first took me into the woods as a boy. Nothing illegal, nothing reckless, just me and the land. So how could they fine me? As I read the letter again, a strange mix of emotions crept in. Disbelief first, then confusion, then something else. Something hotter, sharper. Anger. The HOA claimed that my hunting disturbed the peace of the neighborhood and posed a safety risk to nearby residents. That's the exact language they used, disturbed the peace. The peace that apparently only extends in one direction. Because they'd never once complained about the children who wandered past my fence line onto my property, or the joggers who cut across the field behind my shed, trespassing without permission day after day. That didn't disturb the peace, but a licensed hunter on his own land did. I called the number listed on the letter. I wanted a conversation. I wanted an explanation. But what I got was bureaucracy, a calm but condescending voice telling me the matter was closed and that any dispute would need to go through formal appeal. There was no apology, no acknowledgement that I had legal ownership or that I had every right to use my land as I saw fit. All I heard was policy, procedure, and a thinly veiled warning. Fall in line or face more consequences. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about hunting. It wasn't about noise or safety or community welfare. It was about power. The HOA had decided that I didn't belong in their image of the neighborhood. Maybe it was the fact that I wasn't part of their meetings, that I didn't wave at every SUV that rolled past my gate, or maybe they just didn't like that someone lived beyond their control, someone who didn't need their approval to live his life. The fine wasn't even that much in monetary terms, just a few $100s. But it was symbolic. It said, "You don't own your peace unless we allow it." And that, more than anything, lit the fire in me. I'd always kept to myself. I never interfered with HOA business, never challenged their authority, never even attended a single board meeting. I respected their right to govern their community, but I also expected them to respect my boundaries. That line had now been crossed. And I wasn't about to let it happen again. I started going through every document I had, land deeds, zoning maps, county records. I confirmed what I already knew. They had no jurisdiction over my property. None. The fine was based not on legal authority, but on an assumption of power. The kind of assumption people make when they're used to not being challenged. What surprised me the most wasn't their overreach. It was the smugness with which it was delivered. The idea that they thought I'd just pay up, keep quiet, and adjust my life to fit their preferences. They expected me to shrink, to bend, but they didn't understand who they were dealing with. The more I thought about it, the more it became clear. This wasn't just about setting the record straight. This was about making sure they understood that their influence ended at their borders, and that when you try to bully someone who's independent, self-reliant, and not afraid to push back, you might end up regretting it. The fine was just the spark. But the real fire was lit in that quiet moment of realization, that if they wanted a show of power, I was more than capable of giving them one. Only this time, it wouldn't be in the form of a complaint or an appeal. It would be something they never saw coming. After the fine, there was no going back to normal. Something had shifted. What started as a nuisance had evolved into a matter of principle. The HOA wanted to make an example out of me, but in doing so, they revealed their arrogance. And arrogance almost always hides a weakness. All I had to do was find it, so I started paying attention. I watched their routines, not out of spite, but with intention. Every Saturday and Sunday, like clockwork, dozens of HOA residents would lace up their hiking boots, strap on their water bottles, and head toward the same stretch of woods. It was a narrow trailhead tucked behind the eastern edge of the neighborhood, a quiet forested area that wound around a creek and offered a break from suburban monotony. It was peaceful, scenic, and clearly well-loved. That area had been there for decades. It was part of what made the neighborhood appealing to new buyers. Real estate listings boasted access to natural hiking paths and quiet forest getaways. I had always assumed the HOA owned or maintained that land, given how proudly they advertised it. But that assumption, like many others, they relied on, would soon be tested. I pulled county parcel maps and started tracing ownership lines. Most people never look at these documents unless they're buying land, and even then, they rarely study them in depth. I went through every plat, every recorded easement, every zoning note. I didn't expect to find anything, but then I did. The hiking trail? Not HOA property, not even public. It was private land, owned by a paper company upstate that had once logged the area decades ago and quietly held onto the parcel ever since. No signs, no fences, just forgotten woods that the HOA had quietly used without permission for years. It wasn't theirs. It never had been. This was their weak spot, the flaw in their foundation. They had built part of their identity around something they didn't actually own. Worse, they assumed no one would ever challenge that. But I had every reason to now. I made some calls. The land was not only for sale, it had been on the market for months. No takers. It was considered non-essential timberland, with little commercial value left. Too small for serious development, too rural for major investment. But for me, it was perfect. The process was surprisingly simple. A few signatures, a cash transfer, and a deed. That's all it took to go from being fined by the HOA to owning a piece of their pride. Just like that, I became the legal owner of the very woods they hiked through, the trails they showed off, the nature they treated like it belonged to them. It didn't. Not anymore. I didn't tell anyone right away. Let them enjoy their weekends. Let them walk those paths one more time, thinking everything was fine. I wanted them to understand the weight of what they'd done, not just to me, but to the principle of respect. They crossed a line when they used their position to try and intimidate me. Now they'd feel what it meant to be on the receiving end of power, used legally but unapologetically. I reviewed the property details again. No conservation easements, no public right-of-way, no shared access, completely private. In fact, by law, I could fence it off, post it, patrol it, even build on it if I wanted to. The same HOA that bragged about living next to nature had just lost the right to step foot in it. And they had no idea. Owning that land wasn't just a purchase. It was a message, a silent declaration that they no longer got to define the rules of engagement. They threw the first punch when they weaponized policy against me. But I didn't fight back with anger or chaos. I used precision, research, and patience, the same tools they overlooked. They believed they could intimidate people who lived outside their circle. But they forgot that people like me, the ones who know the land, who pay attention, who don't need a committee's approval, we don't forget, and we don't back down. This wasn't revenge. It was clarity. I understood now that their authority was only as strong as the illusion they maintained, an illusion that shattered the moment I bought the land they pretended to own. The balance had shifted, and for the first time, I held something they couldn't regulate, control, or reclaim. The transaction went through without much noise. No headlines, no public notices, just a quiet change in ownership recorded at the county clerk's office. The land that once served as a hidden gem for the HOA's weekend hikes, nature walks, and family photos was now mine, legally, irrevocably, and completely. The parcel wasn't large by commercial standards, but it was meaningful. Roughly 38 acres of woodland, winding trails, and a small creek that crossed the northern boundary. For years, HOA members had treated it as an extension of their neighborhood. Kids played there, couples walked dogs there, and flyers for community. Trail cleanup days were distributed as if they were maintaining public land. But the truth was simple. They never had the right to use it in the first place. It was tolerated, not granted. That tolerance had now officially expired. The price I paid was modest, less than what a new mid-size SUV would cost. A low price for a high-value message. It was almost laughable how little it took to gain full control over a space that had become part of their identity. They had taken that land for granted for years, assuming permanence where there was none. But permanence is an illusion, and assumptions are the first step toward vulnerability. With the deed in hand, everything changed. My ownership wasn't just theoretical. It was documented, notarized, and backed by every legal right afforded to a private landowner. I had the power to regulate access, enforce restrictions, and determine the land's use without needing permission from anyone. Especially not the HOA that had just fined me under the pretense of public safety and community standards. Their mistake had been pushing too far. They thought a fine would humble me. Instead, it exposed their dependence on something they didn't even own. The moment I realized that, I saw a rare opportunity, not just to reclaim control, but to make a point. They wanted to police my behavior on my own land, so I made sure I could control theirs on land they thought was theirs. There were no warning signs, no community announcements, no public hearings. I had no obligation to inform them. For all their pride in governance, policies, and procedures, they never considered someone might use their own tools, planning, legality, patience, against them. They had ruled by assumption. Now, those assumptions were worthless. Ownership brought immediate responsibilities. I walked the boundaries, marked GPS points, and reviewed maps to ensure clarity. I contacted a land surveyor to verify property lines and arranged to have signage installed. The goal wasn't to start a conflict. The goal was to establish fact. I wasn't interested in debate or appeal. This wasn't subject to neighborhood votes or open forums. The land was mine. That was the beginning and end of the story. I researched legal signage language for restricting access. Private property, no trespassing, would suffice legally, but I added more specific terms to remove ambiguity. Access prohibited. No HOA member entry allowed under any circumstance. Violators will be prosecuted. Clear, final, unapologetic. It wasn't just about closing access. It was about removing entitlement. For years, they had treated the land like a public park. Now, that illusion was gone, and they would have to explain it to each other. Parents would have to answer when their kids asked why they couldn't ride their bikes down the old trail. Joggers would have to turn around when they reached a fence they had never noticed before. And the HOA board would be forced to confront the consequences of pushing someone too far. This wasn't pettiness. It was proportionate response. They had stepped beyond their boundaries, so I had redrawn the boundaries entirely, both literally and symbolically. In doing so, I didn't break any rules. I followed them to the letter. The same HOA that used bylaws and technicalities to impose their will on others had just been outmaneuvered by those same systems. They wouldn't be able to fight it. The land wasn't subject to HOA control. It wasn't governed by their covenants or restrictions. They had no legal standing to appeal, no leverage to negotiate. Their only option was to accept it and learn from it. What they did with that lesson was up to them. What mattered now was that the dynamic had shifted. The same people who once tried to dictate how I could live on my own property, now found themselves barred from the space they had quietly claimed for years. Their assumption of control had blinded them to the fragility of their position. The bold purchase wasn't about retaliation, it was about restoration, a restoration of boundaries, of balance, and of respect. I didn't need to raise my voice or argue at meetings. I just needed a signature, a survey, and a sign, and the rest took care of itself. The signs were installed quietly but firmly, durable aluminum, weatherproofed lettering, and mounted on reinforced wooden posts. Every access point that led into the woods, each narrow trail carved over years of casual use, was now marked unmistakably. There would be no ambiguity, no misinterpretation. The land was closed, and the message was absolute. Private property, no trespassing. Entry prohibited, HOA members specifically barred, violators will be prosecuted. There was no need to single out the neighborhood by name. The intent was clear and the language enforceable. It wasn't symbolic or emotional, it was legal. With ownership came the right to exclude, and now that right was being exercised in full. The passive years of unregulated access were over. Reactions began subtly at first. Fewer people were seen heading toward the trails. Word had started to spread. Some likely thought it was temporary, perhaps a new owner posting signs to discourage littering or unauthorized camping. But over the days that followed, the realization began to sink in. This wasn't a warning. It was permanent. Access was not suspended. It was revoked. HOA board members met quietly, first among themselves, then with confused residents. Questions were raised. Some residents assumed the HOA had made a decision to close the land. Others believed the city had reclaimed it for development. No one expected the truth, that the land had never belonged to them and had been purchased, in silence by someone they'd tried to penalize just weeks before. The irony was unmistakable. A governing body that prided itself on knowing every inch of the community had never checked the legal status of the very land they treated as a communal asset. They had distributed flyers for trail cleanups, hosted family photo events near the creek, and even published hiking routes in community newsletters, all without owning a single acre of it. It was an oversight, built on entitlement, and it had come back to bite them with precision. Now, every trailhead became a symbol of that mistake. Where there were once informal signs of community nature walk ahead, there were now metal warnings backed by property law. Residents who had once enjoyed uninterrupted strolls into the woods now stopped short, staring at signs they couldn't ignore and boundaries they couldn't cross. The silence from the HOA was telling. There were no public statements, no clarifying. Emails. They had nothing to stand on. Challenging the closure would expose their negligence. Any effort to fight back would only draw attention to the fact that they had no legal claim to the land they so heavily relied on. Their power ended at the property lines, and now those lines had been redrawn in bold. Attempts to contact the new owner, now a figure of quiet controversy, yielded nothing, because there was nothing to discuss. No negotiations, no appeals, no compromises. The purchase was complete, the land secured, and the rights fully exercised. The board, once quick to enforce rules and levy fines, now found themselves powerless, confronted by the one thing they couldn't override: ownership. The emotional shift within the community was gradual but unmistakable. First came confusion, then frustration, then a bitter kind of acceptance. Residents who once took the land for granted now understood its value, not because it had changed, but because it was no longer theirs to use. Children who once played by the stream were redirected. Couples who once walked the loop in the evening light now turned back at the posted signs. The landscape remained the same, but its meaning had changed entirely. There were no arguments, no outbursts. Just the quiet erosion of entitlement, replaced by a growing understanding of consequence. One act of overreach had triggered a transformation they couldn't reverse, and through it all, the land stood untouched, serene, protected, and no longer accessible to those who had failed to respect boundaries in the first place. The closure wasn't about isolation, it was about resolution. It restored a line that should never have been crossed. It reminded a group of people that just because something feels like it belongs to you doesn't mean it does. Ownership is not a feeling, it is a fact. And facts carry weight, more than rules, more than opinions, more than community norms. For years, the HOA had operated under the belief that their reach extended beyond their jurisdiction, that authority could spill over boundaries simply by force of habit. But habits don't hold up in court. And now, with a few metal signs and a recorded deed, they were learning that lesson one locked gate at a time. The land was closed for good, not out of spite, but out of principle. A principle that said respect must be mutual, and that actions have consequences, especially when those actions are delivered under the false shield of authority. The trails were still there, the creek still ran, the trees still swayed. But access, that precious privilege, was gone. Not lost. Taken back. The closure of the land marked the end of a chapter defined not by conflict, but by clarity. It was never about revenge. It was about reinforcing the boundary between assumed authority and actual ownership. When those in power begin to confuse, their influence with entitlement, correction becomes necessary, not for ego, but for principle. The real message behind the land closure wasn't written in warning signs or expressed through legal documents. It was embedded in the consequences of unchecked overreach. The HOA, like many governing bodies, had extended its control with the confidence of precedent. But precedent built on assumption is fragile. It depends entirely on others' willingness to remain passive. Once that passivity ends, the illusion crumbles. Ownership is not an abstract concept. It is tangible, legal, and enforceable. The land that had once served as a recreational extension of the community was never theirs. Yet for years, the neighborhood walked its trails, held events on its soil, and maintained it as though it was public or HOA-managed property. That quiet misuse might have gone unnoticed if not for one critical misstep. The fine imposed on someone outside their jurisdiction. That one action, meant to reinforce control, revealed just how misplaced their confidence was. The correction that followed wasn't fueled by rage or resentment. It was methodical, precise, and lawful. It followed the very logic the HOA prided itself on: rules, enforcement, and structure. Except this time, the structure wasn't in their favor. The land was legally acquired, clearly marked, and permanently closed. There were no negotiations, no compromises, just an unmovable boundary that reminded everyone what they had misunderstood. For years, that rights are earned, not assumed. By closing the land, the message was made permanent. Control must have limits. When organizations forget those limits, they must be reminded that power without responsibility becomes abuse. In this case, the HOA's overstep was met not with defiance, but with discipline. And it worked. No one could say they weren't warned, not verbally, but through consequence. The land, once freely used, was now inaccessible. Families that had spent weekends hiking were now rerouted. Children who had grown up with the trails as part of their play area were told it was off limits. All of this didn't happen because someone sought to punish them. It happened because someone enforced a boundary the HOA had failed to respect. What makes the message powerful is its simplicity. Nothing had to be explained. The outcome spoke for itself. Control cannot be extended where it was never granted. Influence has a limit. And when those lines are crossed, a response grounded in fact is more effective than any emotional retaliation. There is also a lesson here for every institution, community, and board that wields power. Stewardship must never become domination. Authority is a responsibility, not a weapon. And when it is used carelessly, the pushback may not come with shouting or conflict, but with quiet, decisive action that permanently shifts the balance of control. In many ways, the situation created a mirror for the community. They had to confront how casually they had taken their access to the land for granted, how easily they had assumed ownership without verification, and how quickly things could be taken away when those assumptions were exposed. The real loss wasn't the land itself. It was the privilege of trust. When power is abused, trust evaporates. The trails will regrow and remain, but the relationship between authority and the community will not return to what it once was. The HOA lost more than a piece of convenient terrain. It lost its credibility, its perceived reach, and the respect of those who saw the quiet correction unfold. Moving forward, the consequences of this event will linger. Future decisions by the HOA will be scrutinized more closely. Homeowners will begin asking deeper questions about what the board can and cannot do. Blind acceptance of rules will diminish. Awareness will increase. And perhaps most importantly, a deeper respect for private ownership will begin to take root. This wasn't about winning a personal battle. It was about reinforcing a universal principle. Boundaries matter. Whether they're physical property lines or conceptual lines of authority, they serve a purpose. Without them, systems break down. When they're crossed without cause, they must be restored, not out of emotion, but out of necessity. The land now stands untouched, not out of spite, but out of integrity. Its closure is a statement of balance and the kind that reminds people that respect isn't optional. It is the currency of coexistence. And once it's ignored, the cost is rarely predictable but always significant. In the end, the HOA didn't lose to an individual. It lost to a principle. A principle that says, when you reach beyond your limits, don't be surprised when someone quietly reclaims their space and locks the gate behind them. Subscribe to Expose HOA Karen for more true stories where justice meets strategy and boundaries are boldly enforced.